The Korean Peninsula in late November of 1950 was a landscape that seemed specifically designed by malevolent geography to punish military forces that attempted to operate there during winter months, and the 15,000 United States Marines who found themselves deployed along the western shore of the Chosin Reservoir in the mountainous northeast corner of North Korea were discovering with each passing day and with each additional degree that temperatures dropped below freezing that they had entered a place where the environment itself was as dangerous as any enemy army, and where survival would require not just military skill but also careful logistics planning that anticipated challenges that most military doctrine had never adequately addressed. The Chosin Reservoir, known to Koreans as Chongjin Lake, was an artificial body of water created during the Japanese colonial period by damming the Chongjin River to generate hydroelectric power, and it sat at an altitude of approximately 3,900 feet above sea level, in a region where mountain peaks rose another 3,000 to 4,000 feet higher, creating a natural bowl surrounded on three sides by steep ridges that trapped Arctic air masses flowing south from Manchuria and Siberia, and that transformed the entire area into what would become known among the Marines who fought there as the coldest battlefield in American military history. The temperatures during late November followed a brutal and predictable pattern as Siberian high-pressure systems moved across the region, with daytime highs struggling to reach minus 15 degrees Celsius and with nighttime lows plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius or colder. And these temperatures created conditions that affected every aspect of military operations in ways that ranged from minor inconveniences to life-threatening emergencies that required immediate attention and careful management. The cold affected weapons and equipment in ways that military planners and equipment designers had not adequately anticipated when developing systems for what they assumed would be primarily temperate zone conflicts, and Marines discovered that the M1 Garand rifles that had served so reliably in the Pacific Islands during World War II became nearly useless in extreme cold as lubricating oils thickened to the consistency of tar and prevented the semi-automatic actions from cycling properly, forcing Marines to fire single shots manually rather than relying on the self-loading mechanism that was supposed to give American infantry a significant firepower advantage over enemy forces equipped with bolt-action rifles. Vehicle engines presented even more severe challenges because diesel engines could not be started at all in temperatures below minus 20 degrees Celsius unless they had been kept running continuously, and even gasoline engines experienced severe cold start problems as battery power dropped precipitously in the cold and as fuel began to gel and as metal contracted in ways that created clearance problems in precisely machined components. Artillery pieces required modified firing procedures because cold metal absorbed recoil energy differently than warm metal, and gun crews discovered that they needed to pre-warm ammunition and propellant charges to achieve consistent ballistic performance, adding precious minutes to firing procedures that were supposed to provide rapid response to infantry requests for fire support. Medical supplies froze solid, with plasma and morphine becoming unusable unless they were kept warm through constant body heat or through improvised warming systems, and medical personnel discovered that treating wounded soldiers in these temperatures required new procedures because exposing injured tissue to extreme cold could cause additional damage that complicated treatment and that increased mortality rates even for wounds that would have been considered relatively minor in temperate climates. The broader strategic context that had brought American Marines to this frozen landscape in late November 1950 was the result of decisions made during the preceding 5 months as the Korean War had evolved from a defensive emergency in which American and South Korean forces had been pushed into a small perimeter around the southern port of Pusan into an offensive campaign that had broken out of that perimeter and had pursued retreating North Korean forces all the way to the Chinese border along the Yalu River. The war had begun on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces equipped and trained by the Soviet Union and operating with Stalin's explicit approval had crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea in a massive surprise attack that overwhelmed the small and poorly equipped South Korean army and that threatened to conquer the entire peninsula within a matter of weeks before American or other United Nations forces could mobilize and deploy to prevent the communist takeover. The American response, authorized through the United Nations Security Council during a period when Soviet representatives were boycotting the council and were therefore unable to exercise their veto power, began with commitment of American ground forces from Japan to establish a defensive perimeter around Pusan, followed by an amphibious landing at Inchon near Seoul in September that had cut North Korean supply lines and had trapped most North Korean forces in the south, leading to their rapid collapse and to the recapture of Seoul and to the pursuit of retreating North Korean remnants back across the 38th parallel into North Korea itself. The decision to cross the 38th parallel and to advance into North Korea rather than stopping at the original border and declaring the mission complete was made in late September and early October of 1950 based on calculations about military opportunity and about Chinese intentions that would prove fundamentally wrong, but that at the time seemed reasonable to American military and political leadership who believed that the chance to reunify Korea under a pro-Western government and to eliminate the North Korean communist state completely was too valuable to pass up. General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of United Nations forces in Korea, and a figure whose enormous prestige from World War II victories in the Pacific had given him substantial independence from civilian oversight and whose strong personality made made it difficult for subordinates or even for superiors to question his judgment, argued that stopping at the 38th parallel would leave a dangerous communist regime intact on China's border and would waste the military opportunity created by the successful Inchon landing, and he assured Washington that Chinese threats to intervene if American forces approached the Yalu River were bluffs that could be safely ignored because China was too weak and too focused on internal reconstruction to risk war with the United States. This assessment of Chinese intentions, which was based more on MacArthur's confidence in American military superiority and on his belief that China would not dare to challenge American power than on careful intelligence analysis of Chinese capabilities and resolve, led to approval of MacArthur's plan for a two-pronged offensive into North Korea, with the 8th Army advancing up the western side of the peninsula and with the X-Corps, including the 1st Marine Division, advancing up the eastern side through the Taibei Mountains, with the two forces separated by rugged mountain terrain that would make lateral communication and mutual support extremely difficult if Chinese forces did in fact intervene in strength. The 1st Marine Division received orders in early November to advance northward from the port of Hungnam toward the Chosin Reservoir and ultimately toward the Yalu River, following a single narrow mountain road that wound through passes and valleys and that represented the only viable supply route connecting the division to its logistical base on the coast. And the division commander, Major General Oliver Prince Smith, viewed these orders with considerable concern because the advance would place his 15,000 Marines at the end of a supply line that stretched more than 70 miles through mountainous terrain that would be extremely difficult to defend against any serious enemy interdiction effort. Smith was a careful and methodical officer who had commanded Marines in the Pacific during World War II and who understood that successful military operations in difficult environments depended not on optimistic assumptions about enemy weakness or about favorable circumstances, but rather on realistic planning that anticipated problems and that ensured forces had the resources necessary to survive and to fight when things went wrong, which they inevitably did in combat operations. Smith's concerns about the advance to Chosin were reinforced by intelligence reports that indicated Chinese troops were crossing the Yalu River from Manchuria into North Korea in substantial numbers during October and early November, though the precise size and locations of these Chinese forces remained unclear because Chinese units were moving at night and were maintaining strict radio silence and were taking extraordinary measures to avoid detection by American aerial reconnaissance that relied heavily on visual observation of enemy movements. The topography of the region between the coast and the Chosin Reservoir consisted of a series of mountain ridges running roughly north-south and separated by narrow valleys, with a single gravel road that had been constructed during the Japanese colonial period winding through these mountains and providing the only route suitable for vehicle traffic connecting the coastal plains to the reservoir region, and this road became known among the Marines as the Main Supply Route, or MSR, a designation that accurately reflected its critical importance to all operations in the Chosin area, but that also highlighted the vulnerability that dependence on a single road created. The road climbed steadily from sea level at Hungnam to the reservoir at 3,900 feet, passing through several villages that would become famous in Marine Corps history, including Sudong, Chinhungni, Kotori, Hagaru-ri, and Udamni, each of which became a key logistics node as the division established supply dumps and defensive positions at intervals along the road to protect the supply line and to provide bases for continued offensive operations northward. The distances between these positions were significant, with approximately 11 miles between Hungnam and Chinhungni at the base of the main mountain pass, another 10 miles from Chinhungni to Kotori where a major supply base was established, another 11 miles from Kotori to Hagaru-ri at the southern tip of the Chosin Reservoir where division headquarters and another major supply dump were located, and another 14 miles from Hagaru-ri to Udamni on the western side of the reservoir where two Marine regiments would be positioned for the planned offensive toward the Yalu. The advance of the 1st Marine Division toward Chosin during early and mid-November proceeded at a pace that was considerably slower than MacArthur's headquarters expected or wanted, with Smith insisting on securing the high ground on both sides of the road before advancing further and on improving the road surface to support heavy vehicle traffic and on establishing well-stocked supply bases at each major position along the route, and this methodical approach led to complaints from senior commanders who believed Smith was being excessively cautious and was not showing sufficient aggressiveness in pursuing what they believed were defeated and fleeing North Korean forces. Smith defended his cautious approach by pointing out that the division was operating at the end of an extremely long and vulnerable supply line in mountainous terrain during the onset of winter, and that adequate preparation of the supply route and adequate stockpiling of supplies at forward positions were not signs of timidity but were essential prerequisites for sustaining operations and for being able to withdraw if necessary, though the suggestion that withdrawal might become necessary was not well received by commanders who remained confident that Chinese intervention would be limited and manageable. By November 24th, the division had reached positions around the Chosin Reservoir with most forces concentrated at 3 locations: Udamni, where the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments totaling approximately 8,000 men were preparing to advance westward toward the Yalu; Hagaru-ri, where division headquarters and approximately 3,000 men were positioned along with critical supply dumps and a partially completed airstrip that would prove essential during subsequent operations; and Kotori, where another 3,000 men were positioned along with additional supply stockpiles, while smaller detachments were strung out along the road
road between these positions, providing security and communications.
Major General Oliver Prince Smith was 57 years old in November 1950, a Marine officer with 29 years of service who had graduated from the University of California at Berkeley before joining the Marine Corps in 1917, and who had developed a reputation throughout his career as a careful planner and a thoughtful tactician, who preferred methodical preparation to hasty action, and who was willing to challenge superior officers when he believed their orders were operationally unsound or logistically unsupportable. Smith's personality and command style stood in marked contrast to the aggressive and confident style that MacArthur preferred in his subordinates, and the tension between Smith's cautious approach and MacArthur's impatience for rapid advances had been evident throughout the advance into North Korea, as Smith repeatedly delayed offensive operations to improve logistics infrastructure and to secure his supply lines, while MacArthur's staff sent increasingly pointed messages demanding faster progress toward the Yalu River. Smith's concerns about the vulnerability of his division operating at the end of a single mountain road were well-founded and were based not on timidity but on his professional assessment of the operational risks involved in advancing so far from supporting forces, while intelligence reports continued to indicate growing Chinese presence in the region. But Smith's careful objections to the advance were largely dismissed by higher headquarters as the excessive caution of an officer who did not fully appreciate the weakness of Chinese forces or the importance of maintaining offensive momentum to complete the conquest of North Korea before winter weather made operations impossible. The logistics situation that Smith's division faced as temperatures dropped and as snow began to accumulate in late November was extraordinarily complex and was made more difficult by the extreme cold that affected every aspect of supply operations from the coast to the forward positions around the reservoir. The division required approximately 400 tons of supplies daily to sustain operations at the reduced level of activity that winter conditions imposed, with fuel consumption representing a particularly critical requirement because vehicles could not be turned off without risking that they would never restart in the extreme cold, meaning that hundreds of trucks and other vehicles needed to keep their engines running continuously even when parked, consuming fuel at rates far higher than normal peacetime or even normal combat consumption patterns. Ammunition consumption was relatively low during the advance because major combat had been limited, but food requirements remained constant and actually increased slightly because soldiers operating in extreme cold burned more calories than soldiers in temperate climates, and the cold created additional supply demands for winter clothing, and for heating fuel, and for specialized equipment like cold weather sleeping bags and insulated boots that were in chronically short supply because military logisticians had not anticipated that American forces would be conducting major operations in sub-zero conditions during the first winter of what was supposed to have been a short war that would be over by Christmas. The single road connecting the chosen positions to the coast represented a massive vulnerability that Smith understood clearly and that shaped all of his logistics planning during the advance, because if Chinese forces attacked that road in strength and cut it at any point, the entire division would be isolated from resupply and would need to fight its way back to the coast while carrying or moving whatever supplies could be transported using only the vehicles and supplies already present at forward positions. Standard Army doctrine in 1950 called for maintaining 3 days of supplies at forward positions, calculated on the assumption that regular resupply convoys would arrive every 2 to 3 days to replenish stocks, and that any temporary disruption of supply lines could be managed using existing reserves until the supply route was reopened. Smith looked at this doctrine and looked at the extreme cold and looked at the vulnerability of the single mountain road and concluded that 3 days of supplies would be grossly inadequate if Chinese forces attacked in the strength that intelligence reports were beginning to suggest was possible, and he made the critical decision that would ultimately save his division to accumulate supply reserves far beyond what doctrine specified, particularly reserves of fuel that would be essential for keeping vehicles running in the extreme cold and for conducting a fighting withdrawal if that became necessary. The fuel decision that Smith made in mid-November was controversial within his own staff and was questioned by logistics officers at higher headquarters who believed that Smith was being excessively cautious and was dedicating too much transportation capacity to moving fuel when other supplies like ammunition and construction materials for the airstrip at Hagaruri were also urgently needed. Smith calculated that the division would need approximately 10 days of fuel reserves at forward positions rather than the 3 days that doctrine specified, reasoning that vehicles running continuously in sub-zero temperatures to prevent their engines from freezing would consume fuel at more than double normal rates, and that a fighting withdrawal along 70 miles of mountain road while under attack would create fuel demands far beyond normal operational consumption, and that resupply convoys from the coast might be delayed or disrupted if Chinese forces attacked the road.
road. The accumulation of these fuel reserves required dedicating substantial numbers of trucks to fuel transportation during the first 3 weeks of November when the road was still open and when weather conditions still permitted regular convoy operations, and Smith's logistics officers established procedures for managing these large fuel stockpiles at Hagaru and Kotori and Udomni that included protecting the fuel from weather and ensuring that it remained accessible even as snow accumulated and as temperatures dropped to levels that made outdoor work extremely difficult.
The Chinese military forces that were deploying around the Chosin Reservoir during this same period were executing one of the most successful military deception and infiltration operations of the 20th century, moving more than 120,000 combat soldiers from the 9th Army Group across the Yalu River from Manchuria into the mountains surrounding the Marine positions without being detected by American intelligence in numbers or locations that would have prompted immediate reconsideration of the offensive operations that were placing American forces in such vulnerable positions. The Chinese approach to this massive troop movement reflected sophisticated understanding of American intelligence capabilities and systematic exploitation of American weaknesses, particularly American over-reliance on aerial reconnaissance, which Chinese forces defeated through iron discipline that required all movement to occur at night along mountain trails that were not visible from the air, and that required all units to be completely concealed in carefully prepared positions before dawn, with severe punishments including execution for any soldier who violated light discipline or who moved during daylight when American reconnaissance aircraft were active. Chinese soldiers moved on foot carrying minimal equipment to allow faster movement through difficult mountain terrain, accepted casualties from cold and exhaustion that Western armies would have considered unacceptable, ate cold food because cooking fires would reveal positions, and maintained absolute radio silence that prevented American signals intelligence from detecting their presence. And the result of these extraordinary measures was that by November 25th, when Chinese forces were positioned to launch coordinated attacks against American forces throughout northeastern North Korea, American commanders at every level from MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo down to battalion commanders in the field remained largely unaware that they were facing 3 Chinese armies totaling more than 300,000 soldiers rather than the scattered North Korean remnants and token Chinese units that intelligence estimates suggested were the only enemy forces in the region. The Chinese soldiers who occupied positions in the mountains around Chosin Reservoir during late November were experiencing cold that was as severe as anything the Marines faced, and were doing so with equipment and clothing that was substantially inferior to American cold weather gear, wearing quilted cotton uniforms that provided some insulation but that offered limited protection against wind and that became dangerously heavy when wet from snow or perspiration, and carrying minimal food supplies because Chinese logistics capabilities were far more limited than American capabilities, and because the speed and secrecy of the infiltration had prevented adequate stockpiling of supplies along the routes that Chinese forces used. Chinese commanders understood that their soldiers' tolerance for cold and hunger was far greater than American soldiers' tolerance, and that this asymmetry could be exploited tactically by attacking at night when American firepower advantages would be reduced, and when Chinese soldiers' willingness to accept casualties would allow them to close to hand-to-hand combat range where American technological superiority would be minimized. And the Chinese attack plan called for multiple divisions to strike simultaneously from different directions with the objective of cutting the road connecting Marine positions to the coast and isolating Marine units from each other so that they could be destroyed separately through sustained attacks that would exploit Chinese numerical superiority and would take advantage of the psychological impact of encirclement and isolation on forces that were accustomed to operating with secure supply lines and air superiority. The Chinese assessment of American military psychology and of likely American responses to encirclement was based primarily on Chinese experiences fighting nationalist forces during the Chinese Civil War and on observations of how United Nations forces had responded to earlier Chinese attacks against South Korean and American units in late October and early November, and Chinese commanders believed that American forces, when surrounded and cut off from supply, would be likely to panic or to attempt hasty breakouts that would allow Chinese forces to inflict massive casualties through ambushes along predictable retreat routes. This assessment would prove fundamentally wrong when applied to the United States Marine Corps, which had a very different organizational culture and training philosophy than either the nationalist Chinese forces or the army units that Chinese forces had previously engaged. But the Chinese plan was reasonable based on the information available to Chinese commanders and reflected sophisticated understanding of how to exploit American vulnerabilities, including dependence on vehicle mobility and on air support and on secure logistics lines that were all threatened by the mountainous terrain and by the extreme weather and by Chinese numerical superiority in the immediate area around Chosin. The Chinese offensive that began on the night of November 27, 1950, struck American positions throughout northeastern North Korea with a coordination and a ferocity that shocked commanders who had been assured by intelligence estimates that Chinese forces in the region were limited and that any Chinese intervention would be tentative and small scale rather than representing a major military commitment. And the Marines at Chosin Reservoir discovered within the first hours of the attack that they were not facing scattered remnants of defeated North Korean forces, but were instead surrounded by multiple Chinese divisions totaling more than than 120,000 combat soldiers who were attacking from every direction simultaneously in what was clearly a well-planned operation designed to cut the Marine Division into isolated segments that could be destroyed separately. The attacks began shortly after midnight with the distinctive sound of bugles and whistles that Chinese forces used for battlefield communications echoing through the frozen mountains, followed by waves of Chinese infantry moving forward through the darkness in formations that accepted horrific casualties from Marine defensive fire, but that continued advancing regardless of losses, probing for weak points in Marine positions, and attempting to penetrate defensive lines through sheer weight of numbers, and through willingness to absorb casualties that seemed incomprehensible to Marines who were trained to avoid unnecessary losses, and who were shocked by the apparent disregard for human life that Chinese assault tactics demonstrated. The tactical situation that developed during the first 24 hours of fighting revealed the full extent of the trap that Chinese forces had created, with Marine positions at Udamni completely surrounded by Chinese forces that controlled all the high ground overlooking the village and that were pressing attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, while the road connecting Udamni to Hagari was cut in multiple places by Chinese forces that had infiltrated between Marine positions and that were now blocking the route that would be needed for any withdrawal, and Chinese forces were also attacking positions at Hagari and Kodori, though with less intensity than the attacks at Udamni, because Chinese commanders apparently believed that isolating and destroying the forward elements at Udamni was the highest priority objective. Smith, whose headquarters at Hagari was itself under attack, faced a tactical situation that was as dangerous as any American division had faced since the early desperate days of the war, with 8,000 Marines at Udamni surrounded and cut off from support, 3,000 more at Hagari under attack and threatened with being overrun, and the entire division isolated from its supply base on the coast by Chinese forces that now controlled significant portions of the mountain road that represented the division's only route for withdrawal or for reinforcement. The extreme cold that had been a major challenge during the advance to Chosin now became a life-threatening emergency as Marines who had been fighting since midnight without sleep and without opportunity to warm themselves began experiencing cold weather injuries, including frostbite and hypothermia that incapacitated soldiers as effectively as enemy fire, and that created cascading medical problems as aid stations designed to handle combat casualties found themselves overwhelmed by cold weather casualties in addition to the wounded from the fighting. The temperatures during the nights of November 27th and 28th dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius or lower, cold enough that exposed skin developed frostbite in less than 60 seconds, and cold enough that Marines discovered their rifles would not fire because the metal had contracted and because lubricating oils had frozen solid, forcing them to fire single shots manually when they could fire at all, and in some cases resorting to bayonets and to hand-to-hand combat when their weapons refused to function. The cold affected Chinese soldiers even more severely than it affected Marines because Chinese troops lacked the cold weather clothing and equipment that Marines had, and because many Chinese soldiers had marched from Manchuria carrying minimal supplies and were already weakened by hunger and cold before the attacks began, and Chinese casualties from cold during the first nights of fighting were staggering, with entire units becoming combat ineffective not from Marine defensive fire but from cold weather injuries that left soldiers unable to move or to fight. The logistics challenge that Smith faced as the tactical situation deteriorated was how to sustain his surrounded division, and how to evacuate casualties, and how to conduct an organized withdrawal along 70 miles of mountain road that was now controlled in many places by Chinese forces, and the solution to this challenge depended entirely on whether the division had adequate fuel supplies to keep vehicles running continuously in the extreme cold and to support the extended vehicle operations that a fighting withdrawal would require. If the division ran out of fuel, vehicles would shut down and would never restart in these temperatures, leaving the Marines stranded without transportation for casualties and without mobility for heavy weapons, and without any realistic possibility of moving the thousands of wounded men who would need to be evacuated during a withdrawal, and the entire division would face the choice of abandoning its wounded and its equipment and attempting to walk out through Chinese-controlled territory in sub-zero temperatures, or of remaining in place and being gradually destroyed by superior Chinese numbers. Smith's decision in mid-November to accumulate 10 days of fuel reserves rather than the 3 days that doctrine specified now proved to be the critical factor that made an organized withdrawal possible rather than impossible, because when Smith's logistics officers conducted inventories on November 28th, they reported that the division had sufficient fuel to support continuous vehicle operations for approximately 8 to 10 days if consumption was carefully managed and if additional fuel could be recovered from damaged vehicles and consolidated at main supply points. The decision to withdraw rather than to attempt to hold positions around Chosin indefinitely was made by Smith during the afternoon of November 28th, after it became clear that Chinese forces were present in far greater strength than intelligence estimates had indicated, and that the division faced destruction if it remained dispersed across 40 miles of mountain roads with Chinese forces controlling the terrain between major positions. Smith's orders to his regimental commanders were carefully worded to emphasize that this was not a retreat but rather was an attack in a different direction, a phrase that would become famous in Marine Corps history, though Smith himself later acknowledged that regardless of the terminology used, the operational reality was that the division was withdrawing from untenable positions and was fighting its way back to the coast through superior enemy forces, and the success of that withdrawal would depend on logistics and engineering and discipline as much as on tactical skill or fighting spirit. The withdrawal plan called for Marines at Udomni to fight their way south along the 14 miles to Hagaru-ri, consolidating forces and supplies at that location before continuing the withdrawal south to Kodo-ri and then down the mountain road to the coast. And the plan required that the road be opened and cleared of Chinese forces at each phase of the withdrawal, and that casualties and equipment be moved using vehicles that would need to operate continuously in sub-zero temperatures for the 8 to 10 days that Smith estimated the withdrawal would require. The 1st Marine Division reached the coastal perimeter at Hungnam on December 11, 1950, having fought its way through more than 100,000 Chinese troops over 11 days of continuous combat in some of the coldest weather ever experienced by American military forces in any war, and the casualty figures and equipment preservation statistics from the withdrawal demonstrated both the terrible cost of the fighting and the remarkable effectiveness of Smith's logistics planning that had made an organized withdrawal possible rather than the complete disaster that might have resulted if the division had run out of fuel, or if Smith had not insisted on accumulating the reserves necessary to sustain operations under the extraordinary conditions that the withdrawal required. The division evacuated approximately 13,000 men to the coast, including all seriously wounded soldiers who had survived the fighting, a remarkable achievement considering that medical doctrine suggested that wounded men could not survive extended evacuation operations in sub-zero temperatures, and that many commanders had argued that attempting to evacuate all casualties would slow the withdrawal and would endanger the entire division. The decision to evacuate all wounded rather than leaving behind soldiers who were too badly injured to walk or to fight themselves reflected both the Marine Corps' institutional commitment to never leaving Marines behind and the practical reality that adequate vehicle capacity and fuel supplies made comprehensive evacuation possible, and the successful evacuation of virtually all casualties had profound effects on Marine morale and on the division's effectiveness during subsequent operations, because Marines knew that if they were wounded they would be evacuated rather than being left to die or to be captured. The equipment preservation during the withdrawal was equally remarkable, with the division bringing out approximately 75% of its vehicles and weapons, including most artillery pieces and heavy equipment, far exceeding what military planners had thought possible for a division conducting a fighting withdrawal through superior enemy forces in extreme weather. The preservation of this equipment was made possible by Smith's fuel stockpiling, which had ensured that vehicles could operate continuously without running out of fuel, and by careful maintenance procedures that Marine mechanics had developed for cold weather operations during the weeks before the Chinese offensive, and by Smith's decision to keep engines running continuously rather than attempting to shut down and restart vehicles, which would have resulted in massive equipment losses as engines froze and became inoperable. The total fuel consumption during the chosen withdrawal exceeded what the division would normally have consumed during a month of normal operations, and if Smith had maintained only the 3-day fuel reserves that standard doctrine specified, the division would have run out of fuel approximately halfway through the withdrawal around December 4th or 5th at Hagaru-ri, and at that point Smith would have faced impossible choices between abandoning vehicles and equipment and attempting to walk out through Chinese-controlled mountains, or remaining in place and being gradually destroyed by superior Chinese forces. The Chinese casualties during the fighting around Chosin Reservoir exceeded anything that Chinese commanders had anticipated when planning the offensive, with casualty figures from Chinese military histories suggesting that the 9th Army Group suffered approximately 40,000 casualties during the fighting, including more than 15,000 killed and another 25,000 wounded or incapacitated by cold injuries, and these losses represented more than 1/3 of the Chinese forces that had participated in the offensive and left several Chinese divisions so badly damaged that they were unable to conduct further offensive operations during the remainder of the winter. The Chinese casualty rates were particularly high because Chinese logistics capabilities were far more limited than American capabilities, and because Chinese soldiers lacked the cold weather equipment and the medical support that would have reduced cold weather injuries and would have prevented wounded soldiers from dying of hypothermia before they could reach medical facilities, and Chinese forces discovered that their tactical advantages of numbers and of familiarity with mountain warfare were offset by the logistics disadvantages that prevented them from sustaining operations in extreme cold for extended periods without suffering catastrophic losses to cold injuries that were as debilitating as combat wounds. The broader strategic impact of the Chosin Reservoir withdrawal went far beyond the immediate tactical situation in northeastern Korea and affected the entire course of the war, because the successful Marine withdrawal demonstrated that Chinese intervention would not result in quick destruction of United Nations forces, and that the war would continue for an extended
extended period rather than ending with Chinese victory in a matter of weeks. The withdrawal also demonstrated the critical importance of logistics planning for operations in extreme environments and validated Smith's insistence on building supply reserves far beyond what standard doctrine required, and the lessons learned from Chosin influenced American military logistics doctrine for subsequent cold weather operations during the remainder of the Korean War and during later conflicts, including operations in Afghanistan, where American forces again faced the challenge of sustaining operations in mountainous terrain with extreme temperature variations. The specific lesson about fuel reserves in cold weather became part of standard military logistics training, with instructors using Chosin as example of how proper logistics planning could mean the difference between survival and disaster for forces operating in extreme conditions. And Smith's careful accumulation of fuel stocks during November 1950 was studied as a case of an officer who understood that logistics was not merely an administrative function, but was a critical component of operational planning that directly affected whether military forces could accomplish their missions or even whether they could survive when things went wrong. The human dimension of the Chosin withdrawal involved 15,000 individual Marines who survived 11 days of continuous combat in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and who carried for the rest of their lives the memories of that experience and of the friends and comrades who did not survive. And the veterans of Chosin formed a close-knit community in subsequent decades as they gathered at reunions and as they worked to ensure that the story of what they had endured and accomplished was preserved and understood by later generations. The nickname that these veterans adopted for themselves, the Chosin Few, reflected both the relatively small size of the force that had fought at Chosin and the recognition that they had survived something extraordinary that set them apart from other veterans and that created bonds between survivors that persisted throughout their lives. The youngest Chosin veterans who survived into the 21st century were in their 80s and 90s by 2020, and as these men passed away, the living memory of Chosin gradually transitioned from personal recollection to historical record, but the story remained relevant because it illustrated fundamental truths about military operations that transcended the specific circumstances of Korea including the truth that logistics determines what is operationally possible, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit, and the truth that careful planning and realistic assessment of worst-case scenarios can save lives and can make the difference between survival and disaster when military forces face circumstances that test the limits of human endurance and organizational capability. Smith himself, who was promoted to lieutenant general and who served as commandant of the Marine Corps schools before retiring in 1955, rarely discussed his role in the Chosin withdrawal and deflected credit for the division's survival by emphasizing that success resulted from the efforts of thousands of Marines at every level rather than from any single individual's decisions. But the historical record makes clear that Smith's logistics planning during November 1950, particularly his insistence on accumulating fuel reserves far beyond what doctrine required, despite objections from his own staff and from higher headquarters, was the critical enabling factor that made an organized withdrawal possible and that saved the division from the complete disaster that would have resulted if vehicles had run out of fuel and become immobilized halfway through the withdrawal, leaving Marines stranded without transportation for casualties and without any realistic possibility of reaching safety. The lesson that Smith's experience teaches about military operations is that success in extreme conditions depends not on optimistic assumptions about favorable circumstances, but rather on realistic planning that anticipates problems and that ensures forces have resources necessary to survive and to function when everything goes wrong simultaneously, which is precisely what happened to the 1st Marine Division at Chosin Reservoir in the frozen mountains of North Korea during December 1950, when 15,000 Marines fought their way to safety through superior enemy forces in some of the coldest weather that American military forces have ever experienced in any war, and they survived not because of luck or because of superior courage, but because one officer had done the mathematics and had accumulated the fuel supplies that made survival possible rather than impossible.
The fighting withdrawal from Udomni to Hagaruri that began on December 1, 1950, required 3 days of continuous combat along 14 miles of mountain road as the 2 Marine regiments that had been surrounded at Udomni fought to open the road and to hold it open long enough for the column of trucks carrying wounded and equipment to pass through, and the operation demonstrated both the effectiveness of Marine training and discipline, and the critical importance of the logistics decisions that Smith had made weeks earlier when he insisted on accumulating fuel reserves that were now enabling the division to keep hundreds of vehicles running despite temperatures that regularly dropped below -30°C. The Marines moving south from Udomni were not fleeing in panic or abandoning equipment or wounded as Chinese commanders had anticipated American forces would do when surrounded and cut off from supply, but instead were conducting a methodical withdrawal that prioritized evacuating casualties and preserving equipment while inflicting maximum casualties on Chinese forces that attempted to interfere with the movement, and the discipline and effectiveness that Marines demonstrated during this withdrawal made a profound impression on Chinese commanders who had not expected to encounter such stubborn resistance from forces that were supposed to be demoralized by cold and by encirclement. The convoy operations that were required to move casualties and equipment during the withdrawal presented logistics challenges that went far beyond normal military convoy procedures because vehicles needed to operate continuously over multiple days in extreme cold while under sporadic attack from Chinese forces that controlled high ground overlooking the road, and the success of these operations depended on careful management of fuel supplies and on maintenance procedures that had been developed specifically for extreme cold weather operations during the weeks leading up to the Chinese offensive. Marine logistics officers established procedures for refueling vehicles without shutting down engines, using portable fuel pumps to transfer diesel and gasoline from 5-gallon jerry cans into vehicle tanks while engines continued running, and these procedures allowed convoys to maintain movement without the dangerous delays that would have resulted from shutting down engines and then attempting to restart them in sub-zero temperatures. The fuel consumption rates during the withdrawal were staggering by peacetime standards, with some vehicles burning through a full tank of fuel every 6 to 8 hours because engines were running continuously and because vehicles were operating under heavy load on steep grades with poor traction on ice-covered roads, and the total fuel consumption for the 3 days of movement from Udumni to Hagaruri exceeded 300,000 gallons, being more than double what normal operational consumption would have been, and sufficient to have exhausted the division's fuel supplies completely if Smith had followed standard doctrine and maintained only 3 days of reserves rather than the 10 days of reserves he had actually accumulated. The casualties sustained during the fighting withdrawal from Udumni were substantial, with more than 1,500 Marines killed or wounded during the 3 days of continuous combat, but the casualty rate would have been far higher if the division had attempted to hold positions at Udumni or if the withdrawal had been conducted hastily without adequate logistics support or without the vehicles necessary to evacuate wounded men who would have died from cold exposure if they had been forced to remain outdoors overnight in sub-zero temperatures. The medical evacuation procedures during the withdrawal required trucks to be designated as ambulances and to be loaded with wounded men in layers because the number of casualties far exceeded the number of actual ambulances available, and these improvised ambulances needed to keep engines running continuously to provide heat for wounded soldiers who could not generate body heat themselves and who would have died from hypothermia within hours if vehicle heaters had failed. The triage decisions that medical personnel faced during the withdrawal were complicated by the extreme cold because wounded soldiers who might have survived with proper treatment in a heated hospital died from cold exposure before they could reach medical facilities, and medical officers made the difficult decision to prioritize evacuation of soldiers who had the best chances of survival rather than attempting to save every wounded man regardless of injury severity, a decision that saved lives overall but that required medical personnel to make heartbreaking choices about which soldiers received immediate evacuation and which soldiers received only basic stabilization before being loaded onto trucks where they might or might not survive the journey. The consolidation of forces at Hagaruri between December 3rd and December 6th provided a brief opportunity for Marines to rest and to reorganize and to prepare for the next phase of the withdrawal from Hagaruri to Kodori and then down the mountain to the coast. And during this consolidation period, Smith's logistics staff conducted detailed inventories of remaining supplies and confirmed that fuel stocks remained adequate to support the remainder of the withdrawal despite the heavy consumption during the movement from Udumni. The fuel reserves that remained at Hagaruri on December 6th when the next phase of the withdrawal began totaled approximately 400,000 gallons, sufficient to support vehicle operations for another 5 to 7 days depending on consumption rates, and this remaining supply represented the difference between an organized withdrawal that could evacuate casualties and equipment and a disastrous route that would have required abandoning wounded soldiers and heavy weapons and attempting to escape on foot through Chinese-controlled mountains in sub-zero temperatures. The importance of these fuel supplies was understood by Chinese commanders who made repeated attempts to destroy the fuel storage areas at Hagaruri through artillery fire and through infantry infiltration attempts, recognizing that if they could destroy the Marines' fuel supplies, they could effectively immobilize the entire division, regardless of how well Marines fought tactically, but Marine defensive measures including dispersion of fuel stocks and protection of storage areas with defensive positions prevented Chinese forces from achieving any significant destruction of fuel supplies. The withdrawal from Hagaruri to Kodori covered 11 miles and took 2 days of fighting through Chinese forces that had reinforced their positions along the road and that were making determined efforts to prevent Marines from escaping the trap that Chinese forces had created, but Marine combat effectiveness remained high despite exhaustion and cold injuries because the division's logistics system continued to function and continued to provide fuel and ammunition and food that kept Marines capable of fighting rather than being immobilized by equipment failures or by lack of supplies. The vehicle convoy that moved from Hagaru to Kodori on December 6th and 7th stretched for more than 10 miles and included several hundred trucks and other vehicles carrying wounded soldiers and critical equipment, and this convoy represented an enormous logistics challenge because maintaining movement required coordinating actions of multiple units simultaneously, ensuring that vehicles did not break down or run out of fuel in locations where they would block the road, and providing security for the entire length of the
convoy against Chinese attacks that focused particularly on trying to create roadblocks that would split the convoy and allow Chinese forces to destroy isolated segments. The convoy operations were further complicated by bridge damage at several points where Chinese forces had destroyed or damaged structures that the road crossed, requiring marine engineers to construct bypasses or to repair bridges while under fire, and in one critical case at the Funchalen Pass where a concrete bridge had been completely destroyed, engineers constructed a temporary bridge using prefabricated steel sections that were flown in by cargo aircraft and that were assembled under extremely difficult conditions in sub-zero temperatures while Chinese forces fired on the construction teams. The final phase of the withdrawal from Kodo-ri down the mountain to the coastal plain required 3 days and covered approximately 30 miles, including the descent through Funchalen Pass where the road dropped nearly 3,000 feet in elevation over a distance of less than 10 miles with multiple switchbacks and steep grades that made vehicle operations treacherous even under normal conditions, and that became extremely dangerous in snow and ice with Chinese forces controlling high ground overlooking the entire route. The convoy that moved down this section of road on December 9th through 11th included virtually every surviving vehicle in the division because Smith had made the decision to evacuate all equipment rather than destroying vehicles and heavy weapons, as some commanders had recommended, and this decision to preserve equipment required careful management of fuel consumption during the descent, because even though vehicles were going downhill and therefore using less fuel than they had used during the earlier uphill portions of the withdrawal, they still needed to run engines continuously to maintain heat and to ensure that they could be controlled on icy downhill grades without overheating brakes. The total distance covered from Udomni to the coast was approximately 78 miles, and the withdrawal took 11 days of continuous operations during which vehicle engines ran continuously day and night in temperatures that averaged minus 25 degrees Celsius, and the total fuel consumption for the entire withdrawal exceeded 1 million gallons, a staggering amount that represented more than 3 times normal operational consumption, but that was covered by the reserves that Smith had accumulated during November when he had overridden objections and had insisted on building stockpiles far beyond what standard doctrine required.